Do the history of how many houses, Doug?
5.
5. 4 of them on Bridge Street.
Yeah, Upper Bridge.
And 1 on Market Street.
Bonus house.
The bonus
I've
house.
never done a PowerPoint presentation before, so this is my first one. My daughter has this all over me, but she won't come and watch me do this. Anyhow, we decided after a couple of the plaquings ceremonies that I did, we were right at the houses and walking out in the streets and kind of realized the traffic was too loud and I couldn't be heard. So I think it was Joey DePasquale who took credit for, why don't you do this indoors? Or was it Kristen? I don't know. Well, Joey's not here, so Kristen. So this is an experiment. We're going to try this indoors, and it forced me to tackle PowerPoint with Jill's assistance. Okay, here we go. That's going to be my sound.
You want that light on?
No, that's all right. Yeah. Is that in focus? Do you know? Could be a little clearer. Anyhow, here we are right there. Here's Warren. This is an 1851 map. The interesting part of this whole group of Bridge Street houses is we're talking about the annexed portion of what was formerly Bristol up until 1873, and we're talking about the very upper portion of that near the town line, the old town line, which is basically equivalent to where St. Mary's is now. So I just wanted to give a little perspective where we're talking about. And then we're going to zoom in a little closer. The graphics aren't too clear here, but here's the old town line, and right in here is where we're going to focus on. Okie doke. And here's a little bit better version in color. But essentially right here, there, in 1851, there is no Bridge Street. There's really just a handful of houses up there. It really just was remote farmland at the time. And this is a modern plat map showing the same area. We have Bridge Street here, the old railroad, the bike path now, and beach here. So we're really concentrating in this central area right there. Okay, here's the way back story. And I ended up going further back than I thought I would. I kind of was happy going back to 1760, but yesterday I got a little carried away. So I was able to actually take this back pretty quickly, and I found it very interesting, but it really, that area, I was able to trace back right to the formation of Bristol in 1680, and it turns out it was land given to the Plymouth County Governor, William Bradford Jr., not the Pilgrim William Bradford. But I was able to check deeds today, which, of course, I moved backwards, but now we're going to go forward. But he was granted a large tract of land in what was known as Mount Home Neck, the northwest edge at its border with Warren then being Swansea. This is far before the incorporation of Warren, on a farm called Boundfield. And I don't want people to be confused with the later William Bradford, who had a very famous farm, Mount Hope Farm, on the other side of town. In 1689, Bradford's Boundfield was about 200 acres, sold to John Safin, briefly passing within his family to Andrew Willett. Now, we finally get to a possibly familiar name. In 1710, Robert Joles purchases the slightly reduced 170-acre Boundfield, which actually exists both in Bristol and partly in Swansea, essentially, traversing the town line. And Robert Joles passes the same property on 1739 to his son Thomas. If you're familiar with the Warren history at all, there was a very famous building, the Ark, which was essentially the last building in the old North District of Bristol, which was at which they collected a toll to use the turnpike, which was basically always been there, and which has actually served as a very good reference point for me in searching these deeds, because if I have a road that's there from the very beginning, I always have something I can refer to and know that I'm finding the right deeds. But in 1760, Thomas Joles of Bristol dies. His estate is distributed among his quite large family. And part of the distribution occurs over a period of 9 years, actually, because the will which was filed was written before he had his last 2 children. And so when he died in 1760, the older siblings started dividing up the land according to the will, and they realized there was no provisions for the younger 2 siblings, so they had to file an amended will or an agreement in 1769, formalizing and including the other 2 siblings. But essentially, I've tried to show the equivalent of where the sibling distributions were. I'm concentrating really only on 4, which are the 4 daughters, and as reference points, we have right here, another reference point I use is what was called the John Throop farm. Basically, there was this farm which kind of acts as the lower reference point for me as well, which is called the John Throop farm, which ownership extended for many years. And if you're familiar with, there's a house right here, which is the Thomas Cole House. It's about 4 buildings below Beach Street. It's still standing. That doesn't come in till 1818, but it was served as another good reference point. Essentially, there were 4 tracts of land that went to the daughters. The brothers, this extends up, obviously the brothers got the land closer to the town line in Bristol. But we're going to pay a little bit of attention down here, because there's, at this time a house was built. I time it to, place it to right about here. If we go. Okay, the daughter Sarah, she's Sarah Joles, married John Ormsby. In the 1760s, they built a dwelling house on her land facing the county road. Over the course of 1769 to 78, Shubiel Burr, who was actually a well-known Warren resident, who was the owner of Burr's Tavern, which was located on the corner of present-day Washington and Main Street. He essentially buys up the 4 daughters' allotments over that period of time. Then from 1772 to 1784, while Burr bought the bulk of the daughter Sarah's acreage, the house that she had built was set off with just a very small lot. And despite what will turn into a lot of land transactions, that house just stayed there and stayed there, changing hands many times. By the late 1700s, ending up in the possession of one Nathan Monroe. Good. So we get up to the era post-Revolutionary War, and really north of the Throop Farm, which is my lower reference point, and south of Burr's own home, is just this one Nathan Monroe house. So basically establishing in that area at this time, there's one house. The same year, Shubiel dies, leaving his Bristol properties to his sons, Samuel, Isaiah, and Nathan. Samuel acquires the area west of Main Street that we're talking about. So we now have Samuel Burr as the main landowner.
Tracks go all the way to the water?
Yes. I mean, they basically were kind of house lot allotments, so they essentially go Main Street down to the water at all times. And that's how the original village of Warren was set out, with similar long, narrow tracks. Having inherited his father's land, as sons often do, and as times change, he had a mind to try to develop some of this, and there's all kinds of transactions going back and forth in the very early 1800s. So we're finally getting to a house. It was a long setup. We're going to focus on 26 Bridge Street right now, which is clearly the oldest house in that immediate area. And as I undertook this research, I know the house had moved as often houses did then. I was really hoping that was going to be, have something to do with that Nathan Monroe house, which I was able to date as being built in the 1760s. But in 1806, one of Samuel Burr's many land sale customers, for $75, buys a very small lot, actually recessed from Main Street in what is actually the corner of Beach and Hall as it now exists. And it was bought for the purpose of building a windmill. And in the deed from that time, it's actually later, it refers back to this as the windmill lot. It's the first appearance in records of, quote, a small dwelling house believed to be Diane Horton's. We're just getting to your house. Perfect timing. So there's reference to a small dwelling house accompanying this windmill, which, and because it was recessed from the road, I presume the advantage being that that was the highest point that they could put the windmill on. It was recessed from the road. A way is created which in many years hence becomes Bridge Street, but essentially it was bridge, the path was built to where in only as far as Hall Street, and half of Hall was created, and that's where the windmill was, is halfway down Hall Street. Kind of, it would be the southwest corner of the lot we're focusing on. What's that?
Southeast.
Okay, let's see. If we're thinking Bridge, Hall, Main, Beach, that corner there, it's the southwest corner. Does that make sense? Okay, we're good. And I'm going to show it here. This basically was your windmill lot. And I believe that Monroe House, what we were talking about, was right here. Because we have references to the windmill lot being adjacent to the Monroe lot, which borders on Main Street. So we have some pretty solid reference points here. Okay, kind of turning to the censuses for evidence of who lived in the area, basically implies there's an Anna Cole occupying the windmill house at that time. And the Monroe house shows it to be Elizabeth Luther, who was Monroe's remarried widow, as the adjacent owner. So the census and what the deeds are saying line up. But by 1817, the records show the windmill itself is gone, and Samuel Burr's son, Shubiel, acquires the lot and the small dwelling house. And then just as I talked about it earlier, that Thomas Cole house, which I use as a lower reference point, The house there wasn't built till actually 1818, and it was chopped off from the John Throop farm I speak of. The northeast corner of that lot, essentially, I believe it was a daughter's husband, and they were starting a family. We moved to 1820, which shows an Isaac Cole in what we call the Windmill House. Monroe House still shows as Elizabeth Luther. We're moving through time here. 1830, Schubiel dies. His wife inherits the property, and Schubiel's brother appears in the census as the occupant of the Windmill House. Then in 1834, Schubiel and Champlin's mother, Betsy, sells the house and lot to Benjamin Hall, who is a farmer a little further down on the main road, but seems to be, he's buying up a lot of land north of him in this area. And we have a William Handy as Hall's first tenant in this house. 1840 census shows the same William Handy, and again, Elizabeth Luther as his neighbor. Then things get a little funny in here. In 1841, Handy's wife, Phoebe, purchases a small lot of land catty-corner to where the house originally stood on what is the present site of Diane Horton's house. So he evidently buys the plot of land which has nothing on it, the implication being that at that time the Windmill House is moved across onto that lot where it still stands. Go ahead. All right, so we can see basically the windmill lot was here, Monroe House still here. Handy, who was living in the house, apparently physically buys the house and moves it onto his newly acquired land, which is where it stands now. 1850 census shows Phoebe and two daughters, Sophia and Phoebe A, occupy the house, the husband having died earlier. The first real map of any of this is 1851, and you'll see this is current Vernon Street. You have the house opposite that, which was the David Cole house, and before there's any Bridge Street still, we see William Handy recessed from the main street, and then it shows in error actually. This is B. Hall, who owned a lot of this land around here, but tax records and other things show that actually it was still in the possession of the Monroe family at that time. Map-making era. Okay. So, and this is the most complicated one. So, 1854, you have the railroad coming through town, and the deed for that wasn't filed at the time. I found it later in Warren, but essentially at that time she sells the back portion of her land, which was cut at an angle to allow the railroad through. Moving the occupants along, 1858, Charles Cole, who was the son of the David Cole at the opposite end of Vernon, they marry and are living in that same house. 1870 shows the family there. Phoebe Sr., his mother-in-law. This point, unfortunately, in the census is listed as insane. And I was able to check her death record, and they listed her cause of death as insanity. So we were kind of wondering how you die of insanity, but yeah, so, and I made the mistake of telling Diane this, and I think her face just dropped. So a woman died here? Okay, 1873, a momentous date. What's referred to that upper district, the North District of Bristol, is annexed to the town of Warren. And the backstory to this is essentially that whole North District is in the boonies to the Bristol village. It's 3.5 miles away. and really right from the start, the only building you had there was the Joel's Turnpike House, and then this one Monroe House that appeared in 1760. The backstory is that Burr, he himself was a Warren resident who bought all that land, and it was really practical. Warren Village was so small and expanding, and here's all this land just sitting there to its south. So there was a drive for the landowners to have it be part of Warren. I mean, Bristol had no interest in this whatsoever, but a group of citizens were petitioning the Rhode Island General Assembly and making their case that they're sending their kids to school in Warren, they're going to church in Warren. It just makes sense to annex this very remote and possibly almost useless part of Bristol to Warren. And essentially, I guess they really got the right lawyer who really pushed hard and pushed it through. So people woke up the next day, all of a sudden they're residents of Warren. And the interesting thing is that Bristol wanted land in return, so they wanted the southern portion of Tuisset in exchange near there's a narrow stretch in between there, but the General Assembly denied that. So moving on, we now have this area very attractive, virtually, in downtown Warren. So there's interest to develop the property there, and things start happening. 1875, Charles and Phoebe sell to William Luther's, the wife of Charles' sister. So obviously, by 1880, we're seeing that there's a tenant there, but the son, Charles E. Cole, is there still as a boarder. And he eventually buys it back from his aunt in 1889. He's there, he and his family are there really to the mid-1940s. There's a son, Urban or Irving. Essentially, it's their homestead. Cole family continues to occupy the property actually until 1960. Next permanent owners were Albert and Gladys Sweet, who bought the property in 1962. The other interesting point about Diane's house is when they said it was a small dwelling house, it was small because it's been expanded since its original state at least twice. In 62, an L was added to the southern portion. There's evidence when the house was moved in 1841 that it was extended to the west. And if you've seen the house, I can't imagine what the original state it was. Can you, Diane? So 62, there's finally wrestled away from the Coles. There's a little activity. 1974, we have Edmund and Kathleen Ferreira. Lived there till 85. I'm missing a sentence in here. After 85, it's bought by McDonald, and he owns it till 2005 when Diane purchases the property. And she really stripped away, 100 years of modernization. I believe she said there was like 4 inches of flooring in the living room. So there was just decades and decades of superficial improvement. But it's everything's back down. The central area of the house she's taken back to the original boards, and I call it sympathetically updating this historic small dwelling house. And here's a view. It's an early view of Upper Bridge Street coming from the west. So you see Diane's house here. This was probably earlier in the century. And is this photograph today of the same scene. And you'll notice that she also added dormers to the back to make it the upstairs livable originally nothing there. And that's the Diane Horton house story. What I should add to that, though, is I did all this research before ever even looking inside the house. I want to see where the research would take me without even really seeing the house or having the house dated. My routine is to bring Lombard Posey in right before I do these things to see if the evidence within the house matches my research. And as far as I was able to go back on that house was the 1806 building of the windmill, accompanied by a small dwelling house. Once we got in there, though, we realized it was a much older house even than 1806. And his thinking it goes back to 1760. So I had to do some quick thinking, but I always had in the back of my mind that original Nathan Monroe house perhaps was that house moved, but the evidence I have is that there were other occupants in that house at the same time as we have people in Diane, so that would have fit the picture perfectly. And it only means essentially that house was brought from somewhere else entirely in 1806 probably as a windmill keeper's very small house. So as we date it, we're going to date it as circa 1760. We're just going to call it the windmill house because we can't tie it to the original owner. That'll have to remain a mystery. So we're moving on to the next house, which is on Main Street. You might recognize as Scott Lyle's current residence. And Jennifer. Jennifer Reynolds Lyle. So we've eliminated a lot of the backstory on this whole area by that very first one. So we hopefully pick up the speed now. But I was always keeping an eye on that Monroe. It's actually was Ormsby, Monroe, and then Luther House. Essentially in 1852, the house itself was advertised for sale, not the land, literally the house. It was very normal at the time. Houses were moved constantly just to suit a better situation. Essentially, the son of Elizabeth Luther, Edward B. Monroe, grandson of Nathan, he basically was moved out of the house following his mother's death, deemed incapable of handling his own affairs due to extreme intemperance. So we have extreme intemperance, we have insanity. The house still appears in its original location on an 1855 map and even an 1862 map, which implies to me that perhaps the house wasn't sold or it just didn't sell at the time. It was probably rented out in the interim as Nathan Monroe moved with family over by Metacom Avenue. In 1860, since it appears no one's living there. In 1861, the lot itself, which was owned by, with no mention of a house now, sold by Edward Monroe's guardian to Benjamin Hall, the same farmer lower down on Main Street who was buying up property in the area. We get to 1862, we have a newly married Shubiel Cole, who, like Charles, was a son of David and Patty Cole, the house opposite Vernon Street. So the marriage pool is very small in that area. There weren't a lot of neighbors and not a lot of choice. It's very incestuous around here. Let's see. He buys the lower southeast corner of his father's land, being David Cole, who so what is now from the opposite of Vernon down to the north side of Bridge. actually below it. It extended down into what is now Scott and Jennifer's lot. He acquires that land, and again, Scott and I were hoping that perhaps that Monroe Ormsby house was really his house, but we'll find out it just couldn't have been. And essentially, it appears that Shubiel Cole built a house from scratch at that sometime after 1862. Okay, and we can see now in 1870, you have Vernon Street here. You have the very informal designation of what is a very established dirt road at this time. You have right here on this corner, that's the Scott and Jennifer's house, clearly in its corner position there. Back we have Charles Cole living with Phoebe, and then we have, what is that? Yeah, that's marked Shubiel Cole right there, Charles Cole there, and our lower reference point being the Thomas Cole farm and house, which is still there. So you really only have 3 houses on this side of the road below Bridge Street at this time still, really 100 years later. Then following the annexation, again, we have development of the area, and you have in 1875 a very well-known name in the area, Charles T. Green Sr. purchases the now vacant Monroe lot from Benjamin Hall. So obviously that house had disappeared. Shubiel Cole had built his own just to the lot the next north, and at that point you really had the Green family moving in and really dominating the area. In 1878, Shubiel Cole sells his house to, we're getting green already with the neighbors here, to Lamira Jones, wife of Charles, she being a Green, not a surprise. And here's a probably early in the century view looking up Main Street, Bridge Street being right there, this being the house. 1880, we show Jones with now George T. He built on where the Monroe house was, to the immediate south. And then we have another construction in the area on the David Cole property, which this James Blake turns out to be the corner house on the north side of Bridge in Maine. In 1893, the junior George plats the land just to the south and lays out Beach Street at this time to give him access to the water for land that essentially he wants to develop. This being the period of development. And Bridge Street is also finally legally laid out at this time, having been a dirt road for 100 years. We have Jones remaining in that house till 1909, when it's purchased by the sister of Mrs. Charles Green, one of the sons of George, Emma Van Sickle. And we're going to get to her. She had already bought the western portion of the back lot to Hall Street, which she'll eventually build her own home. But from the time of Van Sickle's acquisition of the house, let's see, wait a minute. We're mixing up things here. Oh yeah, okay. 1909, before Emma's building of her own house, she buys this corner property. Her sister living on the southwest corner of Bridge in Maine. She basically buys this nice house and adds it to the Green dynasty, and essentially it acts as a rental property for the next 70 years. We have a few names: John and Emma Meadows in the 20s, Leroy and Alberta Staples, he being the Warren School Superintendent in the late 20s, early 30s. By the 60s, we have Lannon Ernest Asselin Campbell of Wichelle Restaurant. Does that ring a bell to anyone? Didn't to me. So we're going through the 70s with various people renting the house. Yes. Oh, here we go. 1949, after the passing of Emma Van Sickle, her nieces Charlotte Green and Alice Whiteman, the entirety of the Green real estate is left in trust to be sold off. It's post-Green dynasty. The house lot, back lot, purchased in 1981 by a James and Muriel McCarty. He, carpenter / car salesman, worked at Auto Show. 1991 changes hands to the Virtues, and then again almost exactly 10 years later to Scott and Jennifer Reynolds Lyle, who at that time undertook extensive renovations, remodeling, and in time building a period matching barn to the rear. And today it stands as a showpiece to passersby on Main Street of the simple elegance and style of 1860s Warren. Here we are. And there it is today, huh? Looking nice. No storm windows, right? Okay. Next, still on Bridge Street, 23 Bridge Street. Okay, tiny bit of backstory. The immediate area north of Bridge became open for development, as we've seen after 1873, the subdivision of David Cole's land by his widow Patty. First house in that subdivision of land is this James Blake, which is the corner house north side of Bridge in Maine. Typo, land extending. The Blake house subsequently bought by Isaiah Simmons, 1883. 1895 map reveals march of building in the area with Isaiah's widow, Mary A. She's established at the corner, but she's starting to subdivide the land back towards the river. And a house is built for her son, Fred Simmons. And we have an 1895 view of the area now, and we show, here's the David Cole estate, which already shows the one subdivision. And then we have 1895. We have Jones and Scott Lyle's house. We have Charles W. Green on the white building on the corner here. We still have Diane's house there. And we're going to focus right here in a second. 1898, Fred Simmons' backyard, abutting the railroad, was divided to allow a house lot, which was sold to William Torgy. I don't know how to say that. His new wife, Bertha, upon which, newlyweds, they build a house. 1900 census shows William, a draftman, and Bertha and Aunt Amanda Luther settled in the house. Quickly enough, there's a need for money, and he's already subdividing his own lot, so he subdivides the portion back towards Main Street, sold to a Richard and Alice Smith. And they build their own house, which would be their current neighbor. But by 1907, Torgy removes to Providence, where he works, his widowed mother Clara remaining at the house in Warren. Circa 1950, Clara's gone. In 1917, Torgy sells the house and property to William and Clara Cole, no surprise, neighbor, property. William's a manager at R.S. Reed Fur Company, and we have Clara's sister Lily Sanders moving in. 1930, we have same family with Sister Lily's son Paul Ramsden, who figures in later. By the mid-40s, Clara's died. The sister's also gone. By 54, William's gone. In 1955, the house is inherited by the sister's son Paul Ramsden and his wife Frances. It's very typical to have, houses going through families and marriages and other sides of families. But Ramsden bails out, sells the home to an Albert Elvira Tavares, who settled down into their retirement home. And 24 years later, good stretch there, the Tavares sell to David and Sarah Weed at the time when the neighborhood was in great flux. That's after all that land went on sale. Sarah, I know as well-known former librarian, director George Hale, now 30 years plus invested in their home in a very special neighborhood in which the house is nestled. So moving on to Emma Van Sickle, who we are now acquainted with, the last of the four Bridge Street house candidates, closely woven to that of the Green family history on the block. One Emma Lavinia Wyman, born in Foxborough, was the older sister of Mary Gardner Wyman. In 1887, Mary weds Charles Whipple Green, subsequently raised two daughters, Alice and Charlotte, at the Green homestead, corner of Beach and Main. 1892, Emma weds John T. Van Sickle in New York City. He was a peer agent, and I kind of imagine the connection back to Providence was the fact that the steamship Providence New York Steamship Company ran between the two places. By 1894, the Van Sickles have moved into a fancy Upper West Side address in New York City. The Wyman sisters obviously both married successful men. Same year, Charles Green builds his own grand home on the site of George T. Sr.'s original home in the house at the White House, which is still standing. And the father's house is moved back away from the street. Obviously very close as sisters, their parents both having died while they were very young. Emma, from the beginning of her married life, would escape the heat of the summer and come stay with Mary in Warren. In 1898, we have the former schoolhouse, which is on the other side of Maine, was moved into the back lot. This on the east side of Hall was since converted to a house. And again, being in the position to acquire real estate, bought that house as a temporary summer place while they made plans to build their own. In summer of 1902, Van Sickles buy that back lot from the Joneses, this being the space in between Scott's house and then where the schoolhouse is on the back. They bought the in-between lot, and at this time built their beautiful Queen Anne summer house, which you'll see here has a lot of nice detail. The balustrade on the porch roof. These are actually striped awnings, kind of bold for their day, I imagine. There's an early view. No, we've done this. Yes. However, the dream was short-lived for Emma, as the husband John died unexpectedly December 1907 in New York, age 62. Emma never remarried, continued to spend her summers in Warren and the remainder of the year in her Upper West Side apartment. In 1941, now in her 80s, she finally moved to Warren year-round to be near the family until her death, age 87 in 1949. The house was subsequently rented out by the surviving nieces, Charlotte and Alice. Tenants over time included Richard Franklin, 63, couple George and Ruth Hedenberg in the 60s, early 70s, and finally Henry Sembrola, 1975 to 80, who I understand was an employee of the town of Warren. And with the death of Charlotte Green in 1980, the house ended up on the market by 81, or it was quickly snapped up by Woody and Lynn Kemp, who recognized it the gem it was. People thought they were crazy at the time for buying, and for 30 years have lovingly been restoring it. And there it is today. And last, this is the bonus house. There's nothing to do with Bridge Street. But it got painted, it had to be done. We're on Market Street, on the corner of Barney Street and Market, very close to Maine. Backstory in this, 2.5-story gable roof Greek revival, situated on land which was originally part of the Miller Barney homestead. Miller Barney, having removed from Rehoboth the Warren, where he constructed his house on the corner, which is Bebop Burrito. That was the Miller Barney homestead, the corner of Market, what eventually became Barney. In 1830, his son Cromwell marries Belinda Pierce of Swansea, where they live originally, but Dad convinced him, I guess, to come to Warren. Hang on, folks, we're almost done. Are we there? In 1833, Miller chops off a piece of his property to Cromwell, abutting his homestead on the east with the intention of the son building a house. Cromwell wasn't happy in Warren or living next to his father, fails to build a house, sells it to one William Bowen, and heads off to Michigan. Never to be seen again. So we have Bowen and his wife Abby. They are the subsequent builders of the house there. And they acquired the property in 1834. We're figuring it was built at about that time. 1840 census, we find them as the only people living in the house. They do have a son, George, elsewhere. 1850, we have the Bowens with a live-in servant doing okay, renting a floor to a John and Sarah Cole, who have a young daughter, he being a blacksmith. And an 1851 map shows William Bowen as owner at that time. And we can see here, right there, if you look right here, you're going to see W. Bowen. And here's the Miller Barney homestead. And next door is the Otis Bullock house, which it's actually been standing longer than any of the others. By 1860, the Bowens had left town, evidently to live with their son in New York. Following year, the son acquires the estate, sells to Stephen Chase of Warren, who buys it as a rental property. 1862, Chase dies, leaving the property to his wife, and then eventually left to their son Frank. 1872, Frank sells to a Frank and Mary Tanner. Another missing sentence. Stays with the Tanners till 1896. I have this all memorized. After 1896, the Moran, French Canadians working in the mills, they buy the property, eventually passing to the daughter and her husband, Joseph Prue. Thank you. Husband outliving Maggie, following his death, house is sold 1960 to a Leon and Exilda Case. Cases lived through their retirement in the house, selling in 73, likely as an investment to John and Joseph Fernandez, Water Street, who quickly resell, however, the following year to a Werner and Zenobia Paulart. There's my missing Tanner selling to Marguerite Morin. It's just out of order. Oh boy, let's see. Okay, who do we have last in the house? Fernandez sold to Werner and Zenobia Paulart. Okay. Ms. Paulart owns a women's clothing business, the Lilac Shop, into the first floor. It had previously been across the street in a back with a back entrance. I'm guessing a large bay window is added at this time. This is the first time I see that it's being used as commercial mixed-use building. Let's see. 10 years later, though, let's see. We've got some issues here. The Lilac Shop and the Pollards leave, selling to Andrew Del Toro, becomes the next owner. Paul brings in Paul and Andrew's antique shop on the street level and continuing using the upstairs for rental. We need some editing. Next, please. Huh? So here's a 1987 view of the house. Pretty surprising. You see where the antiques and the dress shops were.
Keep the glass away. Couldn't refuse the offer.
Yeah. So they needed a little inspiration. What can I say? 1987, Mike Meerman and Linda McGafflin purchased the property with the intent to return it to its original residential-only use, begin the process of restoring it to its original look. 2011, the couple's still there. The building front's restored to its original state. Fresh coat of paint, looking much like it did 177 years earlier. And that's it. One more screen, I think.
And those are the capstones on that little thing going around the house, are the capstones from the George Washington Bridge.
Wow. I didn't know that. So thank you to all you homeowners. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope you all learned something. I learned a ton, and thanks to Jill, my PowerPoint partner, and to Lombard Posey, who couldn't make it tonight, and the staffs at all the places I go to. How long was that? Just made it.
When did they change the name of Swansea?
Yeah, so it was originally, Swansea was the original part of Plymouth County. After, what's that? Swansea. Spellings back then were bizarre. They weren't formalized, but that was the most common, was Z-E-Y, Swansea.
I thought it was after Swansea.
Probably, but spelling in these deeds, you know. But essentially, yeah, what is now Warren was originally part of a much larger area that was Swansea. It wasn't until 1746.
There's a debate whether it's 1746 or 47 when they had this part of Rhode Island became Rhode Island. It was
Right. When basically there was a border dispute between Rhode Island and Massachusetts.
For about 10 years.
Yeah, and it was finally resolved in 1846-7, so that Bristol became, which was very originally Plymouth County, Mass, was established as Bristol County, Mass. But in 1747, they ceded, Mass had to cede these properties to Rhode Island. So it became Swansea, Rhode Island, and that's when Warren was set off as a town. If there's any other questions.
I have a question, though.
Yes.
Yes. In one of the photographs, there was a sand and gravel pit.
Get closer to the mic.
I'm sorry. There was a sand and gravel pit in
That's
one
where
of the.
first park.
Okay, that's why it's dug out like that.
Well, it was almost a natural. I mean, you had the railroad coming through,
Yeah.
and that was their property for a while.
They needed to fill the swamp south of Beach.
And were they already doing that before the railroad came through? It was already established?
I don't think so.
No. Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know for sure.
Okay.
That's something I can.
Well, yeah.
Any other questions? I've got a couple of experts down here.
A couple of experts out there.
There we go. We're good?
Everybody good?